You stare at the screen after sending another message that receives only a short reply or no reply at all. You replay a conversation in your mind, wondering what you said wrong this time. You try to explain what has been weighing on your heart, but people change the subject, offer quick advice, or tell you that you are overthinking everything. Eventually, you stop talking. You smile when someone asks if you are okay, because explaining the truth feels more exhausting than carrying it alone. The hardest part is not being lonely. The hardest part is feeling surrounded by people who know your name but never seem to know your heart. Somewhere inside you, a quiet question keeps returning. Why does nobody ever seem to understand me? Why does it always feel as though I am living in a world that speaks a language my soul never learned? There are nights when you wonder whether something is wrong with you because the things that move other people no longer satisfy you. You notice details others ignore. You carry burdens nobody sees. You feel deeply even when you remain silent. You sense that your life is being pulled in a direction you cannot fully explain. Yet every attempt to describe it makes people look at you with confusion. So you stop trying. You begin carrying your thoughts alone, your prayers alone, your fears alone. Yet even in that silence, something refuses to let you give up completely. Deep inside, there remains a small hope that perhaps your loneliness is not meaningless, that perhaps there is a reason why your heart has always felt different. The painful truth is that being misunderstood slowly changes the way you see yourself. At first, you think people simply need more time to know you. Then you begin wondering whether you should become someone easier to understand. You start editing your personality. You hide your convictions, you silence your questions, you laugh when everyone laughs even though your heart feels heavy. You become skilled at pretending everything is fine, because pretending hurts less than being rejected again. Yet every compromise leaves another quiet wound. Little by little, you begin losing sight of who God created you to be, simply because you wanted someone else to finally say that they understood you. But there comes a moment when the soul becomes too tired to keep performing. There comes a moment when all the masks become heavier than honesty. Perhaps that is the season you are living in now. Perhaps you are exhausted from trying to fit into places where your spirit was never meant to belong. Perhaps you are beginning to realize that your greatest pain has never been rejection itself, but the endless effort to avoid it. There is something deeply personal about that realization, because almost nobody sees it happening. They see your quietness, but not the battles behind it. They see your distance, but not the disappointments that created it. They see your caution, but not the countless times your trust was broken. They assume your silence means confidence or pride, while in reality it often hides a heart that has simply grown tired of being misunderstood. Scripture quietly reminds us that many of those whom God shaped for meaningful purposes experienced this same hidden sorrow. They were often surrounded by people who misunderstood their motives long before anyone recognized their calling. Their journeys were marked by waiting, by isolation, by seasons when obedience looked like failure from the outside. That does not mean every painful experience is automatically a sign of a special destiny, but it does remind us that misunderstanding has never prevented God from accomplishing His purposes. Sometimes the road of faith feels strangely lonely because God forms character in places where applause cannot reach. Think about how often you have prayed without dramatic answers. You were not asking for fame or recognition. You simply wanted peace. You simply wanted clarity. You simply wanted someone to understand why your heart feels so restless. Instead, life seemed to become even quieter. Friends drifted away. Conversations became superficial. Doors closed without explanation. At first you thought God had forgotten you. But what if silence is not always abandonment? What if some seasons become quieter, because God is teaching you to recognize His voice above every other voice competing for your attention? That lesson rarely feels comforting while it is happening. It feels confusing. It feels unfair. It feels like being left behind while everyone else moves forward. Yet many of the deepest transformations begin exactly there, where certainty disappears and trust quietly begins to grow. If these words somehow describe the season you are living through, leave a comment saying, "I understand." Not because a comment changes your circumstances, but because sometimes healing begins the moment we realize we are not the only ones carrying this invisible weight. There are people from different places and different stories who know exactly what it feels like to walk into a crowded room and still feel completely unseen. There are people who have whispered prayers through tears because they could no longer explain themselves to anyone else. Knowing you are not alone does not erase the pain, but it reminds you that isolation often tells lies. One of its greatest lies is convincing you that nobody could possibly understand what you are carrying. Yet countless hearts have walked through similar valleys and discovered that God remained faithful even when everything else felt uncertain. Consider how often you have mistaken being different for being defective. The world constantly teaches that acceptance comes through similarity. Blend in. Think like everyone else. Desire what everyone else desires. Measure success the same way everyone else measures it. But what happens when your heart refuses to settle for what everyone else celebrates? What happens when material success cannot quiet the deeper questions inside you? What happens when your spirit longs for something eternal, while everything around you focuses only on what is temporary? That tension can make you feel broken until you realize that spiritual hunger often creates dissatisfaction with things that once seemed enough. It does not make you better than anyone else. It simply changes the direction of your desires. That change can feel incredibly lonely because not everyone around you understands why your priorities are shifting. They may even assume you have become distant when, in reality, your heart is simply learning to seek different things. There is another quiet struggle that few people talk about. Sometimes you are misunderstood, not because you failed to communicate, but because people interpret your life through the lens of their own experiences. Someone who values constant approval may misunderstand your contentment in solitude. Someone driven by competition may misunderstand your peace as lack of ambition. Someone afraid of silence may misunderstand your reflection as weakness. You cannot control how others interpret your life. Trying to do so becomes an endless prison. Freedom begins when you realize that being faithfully yourself before God matters more than being perfectly understood by everyone else. That does not remove the desire for meaningful relationships. God created us for community. Healthy friendships, wise counsel, loving families, and faithful believers are beautiful gifts. Yet no human relationship can fully satisfy the deepest longing of the soul, because every human being sees only fragments of who you are. God alone sees the entire story. He knows the prayers you never finished because tears interrupted them. He knows the fears you never admitted aloud because you worried they would sound foolish. He knows the disappointments you buried beneath forced smiles. He knows the moments you almost gave up, but somehow found the strength to keep taking one more step. There is profound comfort in remembering that complete understanding has never depended on human eyes. It has always rested in the one who knows you completely and still loves you completely. Perhaps that is why some seasons strip away so many false sources of identity. They expose how much of our peace depended upon being accepted, admired, or understood by people. Those things are not wrong in themselves, but they become fragile foundations. Human opinions shift like the wind. Today's admiration can become tomorrow's criticism. Today's friendship can become tomorrow's distance. But God's faithfulness does not fluctuate with public opinion. His presence does not disappear because others fail to recognize what He is quietly doing within you. Sometimes the greatest work of grace happens where nobody applauds because God is building something that applause could never produce. As you continue listening, hold on to this thought without rushing to resolve it. Perhaps the ache of never feeling understood is not the end of your story. Perhaps it is preparing your heart to discover an identity rooted less in human approval and more in God's unchanging love. That realization does not arrive overnight. It grows slowly through countless ordinary moments, through unanswered questions, through quiet prayers, through small acts of faithfulness that nobody else notices. Yet every one of those moments matters more than you realize. And before this journey continues, remember this truth. You do not have to understand every season to believe that God can bring purpose through it. Sometimes faith begins by trusting His character before you can fully understand His plan. In the next part of this journey, the hidden connection between spiritual growth and the painful experience of being misunderstood will become even clearer, revealing why some of the deepest transformations often begin in the very places where you once believed nothing meaningful could ever grow. There comes a point when the pain of being misunderstood no longer feels like an occasional disappointment, but becomes something you expect before every conversation. You begin preparing yourself for people to misread your intentions before you even open your mouth. You rehearse explanations in your mind that you never end up saying, because experience has taught you that explanations rarely change hearts that have already formed conclusions. Slowly, without realizing it, you begin carrying a quiet grief everywhere you go. It is the grief of feeling unseen, not invisible because people ignore your presence, but invisible because they never seem to recognize the person you truly are beneath the surface. You start wondering whether anyone will ever know the real you. You question whether your deepest thoughts will always remain locked inside your heart. Some days you even ask God why He would create you with such deep emotions if so few people would ever understand them. Those questions do not make your faith weak, they make you human. Many faithful people have stood before God carrying confusion instead of certainty. They have poured out hearts filled with questions while still choosing to trust His goodness. Sometimes we mistakenly believe that faith means never struggling, but Scripture repeatedly shows people bringing their fears, disappointments, and unanswered questions into God's presence. The difference was not that they understood everything. The difference was that they continued turning toward God instead of away from Him. Think back to childhood for a moment. Many people who constantly feel misunderstood today can remember moments when they first began believing they had to hide parts of themselves. Perhaps you were told you were too sensitive. Maybe someone laughed at your dreams. Maybe your kindness was mistaken for weakness. Perhaps your quiet nature was labeled as awkwardness. Maybe you learned that expressing emotion only invited criticism, so you became skilled at pretending nothing hurt you. Those early experiences often leave invisible marks that continue shaping adult relationships. Every new disappointment quietly reinforces an old belief. Nobody understands me. Nobody ever will. The danger is not simply loneliness. The danger is allowing repeated misunderstanding to define your identity. What begins as something others do eventually becomes something you believe about yourself. You stop seeing yourself as someone who has been misunderstood and start seeing yourself as someone who is impossible to understand. That is a very different belief, and it is one the enemy of your peace would gladly encourage because it pushes you toward hopelessness. God, however, works differently. He does not erase every painful memory overnight. Instead, He often redeems them by slowly changing the meaning they hold over your life. The very experiences that once convinced you that you were unwanted can eventually teach you to anchor your worth somewhere that rejection cannot reach. That process is not comfortable because every new season of growth asks you to release another false belief about yourself. One of the hardest beliefs to surrender is the idea that your value depends upon how accurately other people perceive you. If your identity depends entirely on being understood by everyone around you, then every misunderstanding becomes a crisis. Every criticism becomes proof that something is wrong with you. Every rejection feels permanent. But when your identity becomes rooted in God's faithful love, misunderstandings still hurt, yet they no longer define your future. This is often where spiritual maturity quietly begins, not in dramatic moments that everyone celebrates, but in ordinary days when you choose to believe God's truth more than your own discouragement. Imagine waking up one morning after another difficult conversation. Someone once again misunderstood your motives. They questioned your character without knowing your heart. The old version of you would have spent hours replaying every detail, desperately trying to convince yourself that if only you had chosen different words, everything would have been different. But slowly, through God's gentle work within you, something changes. Instead of chasing endless explanations, you bring your disappointment to Him. You acknowledge the hurt without allowing it to become your identity. You remember that Jesus Himself was frequently misunderstood by those around Him. His compassion was questioned. His miracles were criticized. His intentions were doubted. Yet He continued walking faithfully because His purpose did not depend on universal approval. That realization changes the way you approach life. You stop trying to control every opinion people form about you because you recognize that such control was never possible. Some people will misunderstand you simply because they are viewing your life through wounds you did not create. Others will misunderstand you because your choices quietly expose compromises they are unwilling to confront within themselves. Some will misunderstand you because they only know one chapter of your story while God is writing an entire lifetime. None of those situations are pleasant, but they remind you that human understanding has limits. People see fragments. God sees the whole picture. There is also another hidden blessing that often grows inside seasons of misunderstanding. They teach discernment. When everyone seems to celebrate you, it is difficult to recognize who truly loves your heart and who simply enjoys what you provide. But when life becomes difficult, when misunderstandings arise, when your path grows lonely, something remarkable begins happening. The relationships built only upon convenience slowly fade away. The people who were drawn only to comfort begin drifting elsewhere. At first, this feels like another painful loss. You wonder why so many people keep leaving your life. Yet over time you begin noticing something beautiful. The relationships that remain become deeper, more honest, more genuine. God often uses difficult seasons, not merely to remove people but to reveal people. He reveals who loves you beyond appearances. He reveals who is willing to listen before judging. He reveals who values truth more than assumptions. Those relationships become precious because they reflect a small glimpse of the grace God continually shows you. Perhaps you have been praying for God to send people who truly understand you. That is a beautiful prayer. But perhaps He has first been preparing you to become someone who understands others more deeply than you once did. Think about how differently you listen today compared to years ago. Because you know what it feels like to be judged too quickly, you become slower to judge others. Because you know the pain of feeling invisible, you become more attentive to quiet people standing alone. Because you know the weight of hidden sorrow, you become gentler with those whose smiles seem forced. Your own suffering begins producing compassion that cannot be learned from books alone. God has a remarkable way of transforming wounds into places where His love quietly flows toward others. That does not mean every painful experience automatically produces wisdom. Pain can harden the heart if we cling only to bitterness. But surrendered pain becomes something entirely different. It becomes fertile ground, where humility, patience, empathy, and endurance slowly grow. These qualities rarely attract attention in a world that celebrates speed and recognition, yet they reflect the quiet character God delights in forming. While others may only notice outward success, heaven rejoices over inward transformation. If this part of your journey resonates with you, share in the comments one lesson God has been teaching you through seasons of misunderstanding. Your story may become the encouragement someone else desperately needs today. Sometimes, a single testimony reminds another weary heart that God has not abandoned them. We often underestimate how powerfully hope spreads from one honest story to another. You may still wonder why the process has taken so long, why years instead of months, why repeated disappointments instead of quick answers. Those are difficult questions, and Scripture does not promise that we will understand every reason during this life. Yet it repeatedly reminds us that waiting is never wasted when it is placed in God's hands. Waiting stretches faith. Waiting reveals hidden fears. Waiting teaches dependence. Waiting slowly removes the illusion that we control every outcome. None of those lessons feel enjoyable while they are happening, but many people later discover that the person they became during the waiting mattered far more than the timing they once demanded. One day you may look back at this season with different eyes. You may remember the nights when you cried because nobody seemed to understand you, and you will realize that God was quietly teaching you to rest in His understanding before seeking it anywhere else. You may remember conversations that left you feeling rejected, only to recognize later that those moments redirected you away from relationships that could never have sustained the person you were becoming. You may remember opportunities that disappeared, and eventually thank God because they would have required you to compromise the very convictions He was patiently strengthening within you. The story is not finished simply because the current chapter feels lonely. Many of God's most meaningful works unfold gradually, beneath the surface, long before anyone else notices. Seeds spend time hidden before they ever break through the ground. Foundations are laid beneath buildings where almost nobody sees them. Character develops in ordinary faithfulness long before it becomes visible in extraordinary moments. Perhaps your life feels hidden today, not because God has forgotten you, but because He is strengthening roots that will one day sustain growth you cannot yet imagine. That possibility does not erase today's pain, but it gives suffering a different context. Instead of seeing yourself as abandoned, you begin considering that you may simply be in a season of preparation whose full meaning has not yet been revealed. Eventually, a quiet realization begins to settle into your heart, not all at once, but little by little, like the first light appearing before sunrise. You notice that although your circumstances have not changed as quickly as you hoped, something inside you has. The same situations that once completely unraveled you no longer have the same power. The same misunderstandings still hurt, but they no longer convince you that you have no value. The same lonely evenings still arrive, but they no longer whisper that God has abandoned you. You begin recognizing a miracle that is easy to overlook because it happens so gradually. God has not merely been changing your situation, He has been changing you. Looking back, you realize that the person who first entered this season desperately needed everyone else's approval just to feel secure. Every opinion mattered. Every criticism lingered for days. Every rejection felt like proof that you were somehow failing at life. But now, after all the tears, the waiting, the silent prayers, and the countless moments when you wondered whether anyone truly saw you, you begin discovering a peace that could never have been produced by human acceptance alone. It is a quieter peace, a deeper peace, one that grows not because everyone finally understands you, but because you are becoming increasingly confident that God does. This does not mean you stop desiring healthy relationships. God never intended you to become emotionally numb or completely isolated. The longing to be known and loved is part of being human. Yet something important changes. You stop demanding from people what only God can perfectly provide. You no longer expect every friend to understand every emotion. You no longer believe every family member must fully grasp your calling before you can faithfully pursue it. You stop measuring your worth by the number of people who agree with your decisions. Instead, you begin asking a different question. Am I walking faithfully before God today? That single question has the power to quiet hundreds of anxious thoughts because it redirects your attention away from constantly managing other people's opinions and back toward the one whose opinion never changes according to moods, trends, or misunderstandings. There is remarkable freedom in no longer needing to explain every chapter of your life. Think about how much energy you have spent trying to convince people that your heart was sincere. Think about the hours you replayed conversations, wishing you had chosen different words. Think about how often you carried guilt for things you never actually intended. Imagine laying all of that down before God. Imagine trusting Him enough to believe that your life does not have to be perfectly understood by everyone in order to be meaningful. That freedom is not indifference. It is trust. It is believing that the God who knows every hidden motive is also able to accomplish His purposes without requiring universal human approval. As this truth settles deeper into your heart, another beautiful change begins taking place. You become less defensive and more compassionate. Strange as it sounds, the people who misunderstand you no longer appear only as opponents. Sometimes they simply become reminders that every person is carrying a story you cannot fully see. Just as they cannot completely understand your journey, you cannot completely understand theirs. This realization softens your heart. Instead of responding to misunderstanding with bitterness, you gradually respond with grace. That grace does not mean allowing harmful behavior or abandoning healthy boundaries. It simply means refusing to let resentment become the permanent language of your soul. Bitterness promises protection, but it quietly imprisons the very heart it claims to defend. Forgiveness, though often difficult, creates space for healing to continue. You may have noticed that the people who seem strongest in faith are not always those who have experienced the least suffering. Often they are those who have discovered God's faithfulness in the middle of suffering. Their confidence does not come from having easy lives. It comes from repeatedly seeing God remain constant while everything else changed. They have watched relationships come and go. They have seen dreams delayed. They have endured seasons of confusion. Yet somehow they continue walking with quiet hope, because experience has taught them something no explanation alone could teach. God truly is faithful. Not always in the ways they expected, not always according to their preferred timing, but consistently faithful in His presence, His mercy, His patience, and His love. Perhaps this is the invitation hidden inside your own story. Perhaps the season you once viewed only as rejection has also become an invitation to know God's heart more deeply than you ever would have during easier years. It is often during lonely nights that prayer becomes more honest. It is often during unanswered questions that faith becomes more genuine. It is often during seasons of misunderstanding that our relationship with God becomes less about appearances and more about authenticity. There is no audience during those moments, no performance, no reputation to protect. There is only a weary soul and a faithful Father who continues listening even when words fail. One day someone may sit across from you carrying the same pain you once carried. They will quietly admit that they feel different, unseen, forgotten, impossible to understand. They may believe they are completely alone. Without even realizing it, you will begin speaking words that were first formed through your own tears. You will not offer shallow answers because you know how empty those can sound. Instead, you will offer presence. You will listen before speaking. You will understand because you have lived through similar valleys. Suddenly you will realize that God never wasted those lonely years. He was shaping someone capable of comforting others with the comfort they themselves had received. Your greatest ministry may never come from your strengths alone. It may quietly grow from the places where God gently healed your deepest wounds. If this message has found you during a season when you have felt misunderstood, I encourage you to leave a comment sharing what God has been teaching your heart recently, or simply write, "Still trusting." Someone reading your words may find the courage to keep believing for one more day. We often imagine that encouragement comes only through dramatic stories, yet sometimes hope is carried by the simple reminder that another believer refused to give up. As this journey comes to a close, remember something that the world rarely teaches. Not every closed door is punishment. Not every lonely season is abandonment. Not every misunderstanding is evidence that you are on the wrong path. Sometimes God allows experiences that strip away false identities so that you can discover the security that only His love provides. Sometimes He gently removes the constant noise of human approval so you can hear His quiet voice more clearly. Sometimes He allows waiting because certain qualities cannot be rushed. Character grows slowly. Wisdom matures gradually. Trust deepens through repeated surrender. You may never receive an explanation for every painful moment you have endured. There may always be conversations you wish had ended differently, relationships you hoped would have been restored, questions that remain unanswered this side of eternity. Yet even with those mysteries, you can still move forward with hope, because your confidence does not rest upon understanding everything. It rests upon knowing the character of the one who walks beside you through everything. The world may continue misunderstanding you at times. Some people will always interpret your silence incorrectly. Others may question your motives without ever asking your story. There will still be moments when you feel different, when you wonder whether anyone truly sees the person you are becoming. When those moments arrive, remember this truth. Before anyone misunderstood you, God already knew you completely. Before anyone formed an opinion about your life, He already saw every hidden struggle, every sincere prayer, every quiet act of obedience, every tear that fell where no one else was watching. Nothing about your journey has escaped His attention, so do not let temporary misunderstanding convince you of permanent loneliness. Do not let rejection rewrite the identity God lovingly speaks over your life. Continue walking faithfully, even when recognition is delayed. Continue choosing kindness, even when it is not returned. Continue trusting even when explanations remain incomplete. Continue praying even when heaven seems quiet. Continue believing that the God who began a good work within you has not stopped working simply because you cannot yet see the finished picture. Perhaps you will never be fully understood by everyone around you, and perhaps that is not the goal after all. Perhaps the deeper invitation has always been to know God more intimately, to become more like Christ through every season, and to discover a peace that remains steady whether people applaud you, misunderstand you, stay beside you, or walk away. That peace is not built upon perfect circumstances. It is built upon the unwavering love of a faithful God who has never once mistaken your heart, never once forgotten your name, and never once abandoned you, even in the seasons when you felt that no one else truly understood.